So just a few words about our speaker tonight. This is a combined Shabbat in some ways. This is a Shabbat in which we honor our former Cooperberg Master rabbinical interns, which we invite one back each year. And we've been working through the cycle, starting from our first intern, who was in 94 to 95. And every year, on one Shabbat in the fall, we invite a former intern to come back and speak. And this is about our vision to have not just a process by which people come, work, and then leave, but by which the relationship continues, and we both see where they've gone on to, what they've done. We can learn from them as the rabbis or cantors that they have become, and that they also come back and see who we are. In this case, Rabbi Cohen doesn't need to find out who we are. She has remained deeply, deeply a part of our community. And just a few things about her. There is a short bio on page 4 in the Shabbat bulletin, but about her time here at CBST. Not only did she write that book about CBST after she left in the 2 years following her 10 years at CBST, she also is really the most significant editor of this book, the Siddur you all hold in your hands. This year we celebrate its 10th year. It's mind-boggling to me. And we started its writing 10 years before that. And while it is true, I'm not into, false humility here. It definitely was true that it was my idea to actually do this. That's true. I get credit for the idea. But Rabbi Cohen really gets credit for it being done and happening. And many people contributed many different things, but it was her really depth as a liturgist, as a poet, as a Hebraist, as somebody who's deeply, deeply knowledgeable about Judaism, not at all coming at it from a shallow point and making it accessible, but she comes to it with great depth and made a Siddur that 10 years later feels as fresh as it did when we started using it, and has so many things in it that whatever level you're at, if you're a fresh beginner or you are coming like I alone comes from a very serious Orthodox background, you will find things in the Siddur that will be moving, interesting, touching, and there are a lot of interesting things buried throughout the book. But just bear with me for one moment and just look at page 313. Look under the name Ayelet S. Cohen. Do you see how many things in the Siddur? Not only did she edit it and fashion the structure of it and make many decisions with me about it, most of the commentary that everybody in the community loves, she wrote. We decided the commentary is pretty much written by me or Ayelet, but mostly by her, and then we figured if we put our names next to every commentary, it would just fill up too many pages and look weird. So we made a decision that our writing would not be cited on the page of the Siddur, but people who are not members, like Audrey and Rich or Walt Whitman, we'd put their name on the page, and congregants who have a writing. But there are just so many of hers that most of the beloved things that we read are her voice. That's just to give you a small example of the huge impact. The Sefer Torah that we read from every Shabbat morning, our main Sefer Torah, is a Sefer Torah that she commissioned, interviewed a dozen scribes to find one who would be willing to work with a gay synagogue and do it in a way that would be respectful of us. Just think about what we have to go through as a synagogue. There are very few scribes who would be willing to work with us. And she worked with the scribe through the whole process and created that. So our Sefer Torah that we use. The Jewish Theological Seminary was a totally homophobic cesspool when she went into that rabbinical school. Not just homophobic, deeply, profoundly sexist. Those things are often go hand in hand, but not always. And she went in there as a young woman and took that institution on. And if the world can trace, there were many people involved, but again, the same thing as the Siddur. There was one guiding voice that consistently worked on changing the conservative movement's position on gay people. It's Ayelet Cohen. And she suffered greatly for it. They did not like her so much there. And the dean actually said to me at one point, she could be here as an intern, but she would not be allowed to remain here as our assistant rabbi, because while it's okay for students to serve prisons and leper colonies, it might not be okay for them to be there. So that was what it was like then. So it is a huge honor for us. She was here from 2000 to 2002 as an intern, and then from 2002 to 2010 as rabbi, and she has become my teacher. The bima is all yours.
I'm not even sure what to say about that, but thank you, and Shabbat Shalom. It's so great to see so many of you so often this week. I could really get used to it. And some of you who I didn't get to see because it was too crowded on Monday night or you weren't there, it's wonderful to see you tonight, and those watching at home, Shabbat Shalom. I want to start with a couple of words about Monday night, which of course was incredibly moving, and not only a deeply honest and accurate tribute to Rabbi Kleinbaum and her leadership, but to the soul and personality of this community in such a beautiful way. It's so rare that an event like that really captures the soul and spirit of a community and an individual the way that did, and it was incredibly moving. And for me, also to be there with so many former Cooperberg Master Rabbinical interns. And I'm sure those of you who saw us all there saw how much real, deep love and affection and respect we have for one another. That community, for me, has become one of the most, if not the most, meaningful rabbinic communities and friendship communities of my life. I am so frequently turning to people within that group for advice and guidance and support, and we are also just wonderful friends and have a great time together. So there's a Jewish tradition to always leave a corner of the room unpainted to symbolize the fact that the temple was destroyed. So for me, the fact that Tracy Nathan and David Dunbauer, who were my co-interns my 2 years, were not there on Monday, was kind of my little unpainted corner. I missed them very much, and they were so much a part of those first 2 years of my being here at CBST. And I actually think the confluence of Cooperberg Master Rabbinical Intern Alumni Shabbat and Human Rights Shabbat is incredibly appropriate, because it was really here that I think all interns imbibed from Rabbi Kleinbaum's teaching and mentorship and leadership, a rabbinate in which deep Jewish leadership is inseparable from justice work, that is the Torah that we learned from you, and that is the Torah that we learned from this community, and that each one of us breathes and lives in our own way. And so it was incredibly moving to be a part of that. When I was here as an intern, I was extremely active in the various justice initiatives that we were involved with at the time, many revolving around LGBT civil rights in New York State at the time. And as many of you know, since leaving CBST, I've been on the board for many years of Truah, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, another social justice and human rights Jewish organization which is completely full of CBST alumni. As Rabbi Kleinbaum said, Rachel Contraster is one of its major leaders and really the prime architect behind many of its campaigns and justice initiatives. Rabbi Kleinbaum was a founding board member. Marisa James used to work there. Jill Jacobs is a Cooperberg Master Rabbinical Intern alumni spouse. And so the DNA of these two groups are very deeply connected. And now in my work as director of the New Israel Fund in New York and the human rights work that we support in Israel, I feel very much the legacy and the imprint of the time that I spent here, and the work of moving forward and staying focused on possibility, even in difficult days. And I think this week is actually a perfect example of that. The news this week, like many of the weeks in this past year, just kept coming in ways that deeply shook me and frightened me. And so in those moments, I look for the points of light that can bring me strength and comfort. And so for me, all week, I kept thinking of watching our daughter Galia, watching Hillary Clinton quoting Adrian Rich from our Siddur at an event celebrating Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum. And that's really what carried me through this terrifying week. Joseph, in this week's Parsha, is kind of in a similar frame of mind. As Ayalon said, he runs into crisis after crisis throughout the Parsha of this week. He is thrown into that pit by his brothers. He somehow emerges from that and lands in Potiphar's home. He thinks it's going well before he knows that he's back in jail again. He could be deeply in despair. He could feel deeply abandoned. But instead, he is aware of the presence of God with him throughout these moments. Another one of my favorite rabbinic teachers, my partner Mark, teaches that from Joseph we learn the attribute of bitachon, of trust in God. That he understands himself as responsible for helping to bring out the hidden presence of God into the world. He understands himself as a conduit for God's presence, almost to manifest the light that's concealed in the world. And so throughout the story of Joseph, and this is different from the stories of the patriarchs that precede him, where we hear God speaking directly to them. During the story of Joseph, instead, it's the narrator voice saying, and God was with him. And God was with him in these most difficult moments. And there's this sense of Joseph knowing, and he's often portrayed differently. And certainly, if you know Joseph best through Andrew Lloyd Webber's fantastic musical, Joseph is not so humble and takes a lot of credit for all the good things that he's doing. But actually, if you look at the text in Breshit, a little different from Andrew Lloyd Webber, but a very useful source text for this particular story, he is constantly saying, it's not me, it's God. The wisdom that I have, the experience I have, the gifts that I bring, whether it's interpreting dreams or figuring out what to do, it comes from God, it doesn't come from me. And so here you would think, here is a person who has been abandoned by his brothers, who's been thrown into jail, and instead of succumbing to despair, he's looking for the presence of God in his life. The rabbis teach that at creation there was a cosmic flash of light that extended to the end of the universe. And that was the light from the first day, Vayehi Or, that first flash of light of creation. But that light only lasted for 36 hours. And then it became hidden away. And the rabbis taught that it was hidden so that we would have to work to reveal it. That human beings would have the task of perceiving its continued existence and revealing it through our own acts of study and our acts of mitzvot, of good work in the world. It's called in rabbinic language, Or HaGanuz, hidden light. Revealed only, it was said, to the 36 Lamed Vavniks, the 36 righteous people who would do this good work in their lives. We look for those people throughout our lives, and in some ways we try to be them in the world. For me, when I think about the work of human rights, it's really about trying to find that light that it is incumbent upon us to reveal in the world. So tonight on Human Rights Shabbat, I think of Eleanor Roosevelt, one of my personal heroes, who of course was the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This year, Mark and I have gone on 2 Roosevelt pilgrimages. We went to the FDR Library, actually on my father's birthday in May, and planned to spend an afternoon and ended up spending 2 whole days there. We got completely engrossed in the way that the exhibit was created. You can actually read the documents and go through the manuscripts. It's an incredible experience. Someone here said they live in the Hudson Valley. Go there. It's amazing. It's beautiful. But also honest. It addresses Roosevelt's failings as well as his achievements in an incredibly honest way that speaks to putting him in the historical context, his failings as a person and his failings as a president. And you also see the hand of Eleanor Roosevelt, who herself had to go through quite a journey. And by the way, we weren't done on that trip. We couldn't make it over to Valkill, her home, so we went back there this October. Because for me, she's such a fascinating character. And she herself was born into tremendous privilege and had to work through a lot of bias and prejudice and anti-Semitism that kind of was the inherited culture of her youth. She also grew up into a lot of trauma, and she learned from her life, from really getting to know Americans, not only as they existed in privileged New York, but throughout the country, what was really going on. And she was constantly handing letters to her husband, the president, to push him on immigration, to push him on allowing more Jewish refugees to come into the country, to push him on race and racism, to try to convince him not to do what he did on Japanese internment. And sometimes she was able to convince him, and sometimes she wasn't. But you see that hand and that voice, it's incredible that she had that focus and that faith to continue pushing and to continue advocating and to finally, in her whole new life, post her identity as First Lady, to become the architect of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to declare that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Now, as Ayalon said earlier, very, very beautifully, this is something that we know, but it's something that we need to have moments that remind us, to moments of awareness, moments of discernment, to reconnect us to that awareness. It's always important to do human rights work, but it's not always easy. And it's not always easy even to be able to look at crises of human rights, at violations of human rights. It's easiest, not surprisingly, when we are the ones being targeted or when we feel closest to the ones who are being targeted. When there is a crisis of anti-Semitism, when there was a crisis of homophobia and transphobia, we can see the problem, we can feel the problem, and all the more so when there's a clear us and them, when they are the faraway perpetrators, whether it is Uganda's terrible homophobic, dangerously homophobic policies, whether it's the crisis right now with the Rohingya, when there's a clear them, who's the bad guy, and a connected us that we relate to, then it's easy to see the problem, and it's easiest to step up and to speak out and to try to address the problem. It's a little harder when we don't feel connected to the people who are suffering. And this is something that we have to push ourselves to do. And sometimes we can look within our Jewish tradition and values and try to make the connections. And that's behind some of the incredible work that's happening right here in this community, the effort to become a sanctuary synagogue, the work against Islamophobia, work trying to protect the dreamers, because we reach into our own experience of being immigrants, of being other, of being stranger, of being oppressed. And then we can feel closer to that other who is suffering right now. So it's not us that's suffering, but we can find a commonality. Or some of the work that I became close to through my involvement with Torah, which has done an incredible campaign for justice for farm workers in this country, and an incredible campaign specifically with tomato workers in Immokalee, Florida. Anyone who has eaten a tomato in this country has eaten a tomato that was picked in Immokalee, Florida. And an incredible initiative there that was completely led by the workers themselves to achieve dignity and human rights in the field. And for me, until I actually traveled to Immokalee and sat face to face with these tomato pickers, I will admit tomatoes are not my favorite vegetable, but, or fruit technically, I know. It awakened me to that issue in a way that I honestly hadn't been before. And sometimes we have to get out of the comfort of what's familiar to us to teach us about an issue. And then we can internalize it in a different way, but still it's easier when the bad guy is far away. It's someone we don't know. It's someone who we deeply disagree with. It's someone who feels very, very far away from us. The hardest thing to do, and the hardest way in which to be aware of human rights, is when we are actually connected to the people in power, and sometimes even more connected to the people in power than to the people who are suffering. And that's at the heart of much of the human rights work that the New Israel Fund supports in Israel. I would say it is hands down our least popular work. It's hard to talk about. It's much easier to talk about exciting initiatives and things to be proud of, and I'd rather talk about that, and I'd rather think about that. The hardest thing to do is to look in the mirror and see the most difficult truths about ourselves. So the grantees that the New Israel Fund supports working in the human rights sector in Israel are trying to do that, and it does not make them popular. It does not make a lot of people want to think about what happens when the state of Israel looks in the mirror and looks at the cost of some of its most difficult and problematic policies. But for me, when I look at grantees, at organizations like Mahsom Watch, which really started as a group of women who were deeply concerned about the cost of the occupation of Palestinians on the soul of the state of Israel. They were worried about what it was doing to Israelis. And so women started going to checkpoints and watching and just being there. And it turned out that when young, terrified Israeli soldiers knew that an Israeli Jewish grandmother was watching them, it changed the tenor of the conversation when they were talking to a Palestinian who was coming through the checkpoint. They were more aware of their behavior. They weren't actually looking in a mirror, but in the eyes of someone else's Jewish grandmother, they looked in the mirror and they changed the way that they asked questions or spoke to a person going through a checkpoint. And sometimes just that act of watching can shift the dynamic tremendously. The women of Mahsom Watch, not only women now, also are behind an incredible initiative called C-Day. Because of the movement restrictions now for Palestinians living in the West Bank, it's almost impossible. It's very expensive and very, very difficult to get to the beach, even though it's not that many miles away. And so one of the things that Mahsom Watch does every year is they organize a day taking Palestinian families from the West Bank to the beach outside of Tel Aviv, and to just be there and enjoy. And even in that face-to-face and looking in the eyes of another person, it changes the dynamic. All of a sudden, the Israeli Jews that those Palestinians know are not just this terrified soldier at the checkpoint, but also people having a good time at the beach together, and that changes the story. One of the most highly publicized and most difficult stories of this year was an incident where Elor Azaria, an Israeli soldier, shot an incapacitated Palestinian terrorist. This was very much in the news this summer, and it was caught on tape because of initiative that another human rights organization, B'Tselem, does, which is which has been, we see in New York now with police accountability, the idea that if you photograph and document and videotape interactions between, police and mostly men of color, there between soldiers and border police and Palestinians, you can document the situation. And this was caught on film, and it was seen all over Israel, and it raised the issue in an incredibly powerful way. And it was very, very painful. No one wanted to believe that this was true. No one wanted to believe that an Israeli soldier, a medic actually, would shoot an incapacitated Palestinian, but he did. And then the system worked the way it should. He was actually brought to the courts. And what's played out since then, in the months since then, is this interesting conflict between should this soldier be held accountable for what he did? Should his sentence be reduced or almost evaporated? What is the value of a human life? These are really painful stories. They're not stories I enjoy telling. But I have to say that for me, knowing that there are so many Israeli activists who are working to do this work, to tell the painful stories, to hold up the mirror, to say just trying to not talk about it isn't going to solve the problem. Hoping that nobody knows, and that, God forbid, we should talk about this stuff outside of Israel, which is the most painful, the airing the dirty laundry, the opening Israel up to painful criticism in a time that feels really scary, that's not a good enough reason not to tell the story. That what we need to do is talk about it, is shine a light on it, is to expose it to oxygen, and then we can work on how to solve the problem. For me, it goes back to Joseph. It goes back to bitachon, to believing that somehow that hidden light can still be revealed. That if people work through their fear and work through their shame and allow themselves to be motivated by their love of Israel, their love of other human beings, they can find that hidden light. So remember, the rabbis said that light of God was revealed only to 36 people, to the Lamed Vav next, to these 36 righteous people. 36 also happens to be the number of lights that are kindled on Hanukkah. If you count up the candles from every night, don't count the shamash, that one doesn't count, you get to 36 lights of Hanukkah. So here we are, just a few days before Hanukkah. It's a reminder for us. It's not about creating the light. That's not what we're doing on Hanukkah. It's about trusting that it's there. And it's about exploring our own capacity to reveal that light through our words and through our deeds. That is what Joseph is doing. And that is what days like this, Human Rights Shabbat, are asking us to do. There's an incredible midrash that a colleague of mine, Rabbi Cheryl Peretz, brought this week in reaction to the terrifying fires in Los Angeles. It's a midrash from Breshit Rabbah from a couple of parshiot ago. It's a teaching of Rabbi Isaac, which tells the story of a man who's traveling from place to place when he sees a birah doleket, a fiery palace. He looks at the palace and he wonders, is it possible that that palace lacks a caretaker? The owner of the palace looks out and he says, it's me. I am the caretaker. I'm the owner of the palace. Similarly, Rabbi Isaac says, is it possible that the world lacks a caretaker? And the Blessed Holy One looks out and says to him, I am the sovereign of the universe. There are many ways to interpret that term, Bira Doleket, that fiery palace. One is really this palace in flames, representing a world engulfed in chaos, in pain, and destruction. In this reading, the wanderer, who they understand to be Abraham at the very beginning of his journey, wonders if the world actually has a caretaker and who possibly could be responsible to repair the world. And God's answer to the question to Avram at the very beginning of his journey in Breshit comes from within that fiery palace. It's the still, small voice of resilience that somehow provides for the courage and the hope in the face of tragedy and destruction. In other words, despite the feeling that the flames of destructions are pursuing him, Avram finds reason to believe in God, in the world, and in himself. He looks towards the end of the raging flames, and instead, he sees a palace illuminated in light. So we're heading towards Hanukkah. We are in a time where we feel engulfed often by chaos and by fear. It is to us to discern between the kinds of fire. It is to us to discern between the kinds of light, and to find within ourselves and to find within each other that strength to reveal that holy, hidden light. Shabbat Shalom.